The diner smelled of frying oil, stale coffee, and lemon cleaner, a small constellation of ordinary scents that had become Elias's entirety. He felt the vinyl of the booth under his thighs, cool and cracked, the paper menu rough under his thumb, the metallic clink of spoons like tiny alarms. Outside, rain hit the neon like a percussion section, each drop a tiny white drum against the glass. He tasted burnt roast and sugar from the last customer that left a lipstick smudge on his cup and carried the ghost of cigarettes on the collar of his jacket. Across from him, a dog-eared Polaroid lay face up, a boy with a gap tooth grinning at the camera, its color slightly faded like a memory that refused to die. Elias moved through the evening routine like a man in a small boat on a big dark river, tethered to a job that paid enough and a promise that had to be kept. The promise was a name he had stopped using out loud, a name that fit in the tight pocket over his heart and in the grooves of the photo. He had not slept for more than a night at a time in years without waking to see that face in the empty doorway of his mind. There had been a time when his world smelled of cedar and old money, when his hands had been soft, and the room he left behind had a piano and a balcony that looked over lights like stars fallen into water. He had walked away. He had left a man whose name now cut his tongue with the weight of everything he had given up. The memory of that life sat under his ribs like a stone, round and heavy and smooth. He had hoped its weight would keep him down, keep him safe. Then the call came. The voice on the other end was breathless and small and said two words that made the paper menu in his hands look like a map to a different country. The boy had been taken from the playground by men with black jackets, no sirens, the kind of quiet that meant planning and intention. Elias felt his throat go hollow, the sound in his ears like someone throwing a cloth over a bell. He stood so fast the chair scraped. He felt the stupid, almost erotic heat of panic around his ribs, the skin on his knuckles tightening. He thought of the Polaroid and how he had promised that face he would be a fortress, even if he had failed at everything else. The earth under his feet was suddenly uncovered. He needed someone who could move mountains, or at least move men with teeth. There was one name that had always moved things. There was one man who had made a world where promises were enforced with silence and weight. Elias had never imagined going back. He never imagined asking. The rain outside thickened into a sheeting that blurred the city into a smear of light. He wrapped his fingers around the photo as if it were a talisman, and felt a decision form in his jaw like a second, harder bone. He would go. He would find Marco Vellani. He took the bus across the city, past neighborhoods that smelled of laundry soap and diesel, past a pharmacy that played static in the early morning, until the skyline narrowed to glass teeth and towers. As he moved closer to the river of power, his own past tightened like a net. Marco Vellani was a name that landed in rooms and made air change temperature. People said he could make a market disappear, make votes shift, make entire neighborhoods take a different breath. They also said he kept his own scars hidden beneath tailored suits and an even colder kindness. Elias had once stood under that kindness and felt a fierce, dangerous kind of belonging. He had loved and left and been left with a guilt that tasted like iron. Now he stepped into that orbit again, with a small paper in his pocket that detailed the playground and the last photograph of the boy before the men came. He went first to an old contact, Anton, who ran a locksmith shop 2 blocks from the river. Anton had watchful eyes and grease under his nails, and he asked questions in the manner of someone who weighed the currency of fear. Their conversation was quick and full of small gestures that spoke louder than words. Anton shook his head and said the place to go was not the police. He said the police moved slow and got bribed as often as they got paid, and that sometimes the only way to pull a child out of a world was with someone who owed a different kind of debt. Then Anton introduced Elias to Enzo, an informant who worked the docks and kept his ears open in exchange for a warm bed and a small monthly stipend. Enzo smelled of salt and old tobacco, and he produced a grainy video from his phone showing the boy being herded into a van. It was small proof, a ragged frame of humanity reduced to motion. Enzo suggested a name whispered by sailors and debtors, a leader who handled contracts the police would not touch. That name was Marco. The suggestion landed like a sigh and an accusation at once. Elias felt like he had walked into a room and the walls were moving in. He needed access. He needed an audience. He needed to remember how to speak to a man whose world was built on the obedience of others. Elias arranged to be taken to a place where introductions were currency. He met with Carmen, a bartender at a jazz club that had once been a satellite of Marco's social life. Carmen's hand was warm on his arm, and she refused payment for the ride. She said many things in the dark while the car threaded narrow lanes. The city had shifted, friends had become liabilities, and Marco had changed in a way that calcified him. When they arrived at the penthouse, the air inside smelled of polished wood, cold citrus, and expensive cologne. Marble reflected light like a lake, and every surface had the care of a king's chamber. He saw Marco for the first time in years, and almost did not recognize the geometry of his face. Marco was older, but not softened, the jaw shorter now with a scar along the mouth that had not been there before, the eyes the color of river mud and capable of catching light. He wore his power with a silence that made people speak around him. Elias saw immediately that he had become a fortress, and that fortresses could harbor secrets as easily as they harbored money. The conversation between them was a series of small detonations. Marco's voice was even and low and broke the room like a metronome. Elias tried to explain what had happened, to fold himself small and honest and human in front of someone who had been both his lover and his doom. Marco listened, fingers folded, with the expression of a man who made economies of feeling for expediency. The dialogue bloomed and tightened like a net. There were pauses full of watched air, exchanges that were more about what was left unsaid than words themselves. He asked Marco for a favor, knowing favors from Marco were paid with a currency Elias might not afford. Marco asked why his life had been abandoned and why the boy mattered now. Elias tried to explain allegiance and guilt and the soft promises men make to themselves when all else has been broken. There were 10 changes of posture, of eyes shifting, of breaths measured like gunshots. Marco finally said he would listen and see, and that would be a dangerous mercy. He asked for proof, he asked for names, he asked what Elias had sacrificed to walk back into that light. Elias gave the Polaroid and watched as Marco turned it in his hands like a coin, the image catching his practiced gaze. Marco asked about the boy traits, the face, any trait that might suggest lineage, and Elias said nothing that could be proved. Marco agreed to move, to activate a network that smelled of hush and muscle. He gave orders that rippled and folded into the city like a tide. But his voice was flat, and something in his face went volcanic the moment he saw the boy video Enzo had provided on a cracked phone. Marco's pupils tightened like a trap. The negotiation that followed was not just words. It was strategy disguised as casual cruelty. There were 10 to 12 exchanges in that room alone, each sentence a scalpel, removing something tender until the conversation reached bone. Marco asked about Elias's reasons, and Elias asked about the cost. Marco named a price that was not money. He asked for a commitment that would rebind Elias to a world he had tried to leave. Elias swallowed and told Marco to take it. Take his name, take his silence, take anything if they would bring the boy back. Marco looked at Elias like a man deciding whether to let a candle burn out or to strike a match and set a forest ablaze. He accepted, with the condition that Elias join a pact, a temporary alliance that would put him on the inside and make him complicit in things he had promised himself he would never again be. Elias agreed. He felt the flat taste of iron at the back of his throat and a rising heat like guilt or desire. Marco sent out signals in all directions. Calls to Rafi, his chief of security, to Lucia, the fixer, to Victor, the man responsible for mercenary muscle in the East Quarter. Names became levers, and men moved like pieces on a board. Anton texted Elias with a single phrase that was at once a prayer and a threat. Elias had crossed into a world where silence had weight and actions had consequences that echoed like artillery. Unbeknownst to Elias, one of Marco's men had already watched the Polaroid and felt a twinge too familiar. The next hours were a fever of movement and very precise violence. Marco mobilized a small fleet. Rafi, broad and mute, with hands that could break silence or bones. Lucia, who could secure paperwork and blackmail, and who smelled always faintly of lemons and ash. Theo, an old soldier who kept his past like an old coat. Dr. Pierce, a forensic friend, sympathetic enough to run tests that the police would not. And a man named Gabriel, who kept a van of equipment and the patience of a surgeon. They gathered in Marco's basement, where maps were spread like prayers. The room smelled of coffee, sweat, and the faint metallic tang of adrenaline. Elias watched as people who had once been shadows in his old life became actors given lines. They discussed surveillance and custody chains and how to move a child without tripping the censors of a city asleep to small griefs. The dialogue here was tactical and precise. They talked about trade routes, about cameras and blind spots, about cadence of patrols, and the weight of a false lead. Forensic details came in crisp, measured bursts. Dr. Pierce explained in 3 sentences the way DNA trails could be obscured if the movement was calculated, and how they could track a van if its tire tread left a pattern on gravel known to a few. These procedural descriptions were technical and brief, the kind of clarity that made Elias both grateful and sick. He learned how to read surveillance logs like scripture, how to parse a manifest, how to know which checkpoints were rubber stamp and which were real teeth. Marco listened and adjusted, folding new facts into his understanding with the cold pleasure of a mind that enjoyed the architecture of control. The plan formed like a hurricane's eye. They would find the drop. They would cut the supply lines. They would find the cell and extract the boy without alerting those that wanted to be quiet. There were 3 moments of pressure that behaved like living things and demanded choices. The first came the night an informant in the docks reported seeing a child bundled into a van and driven toward the industrial pier. Elias was the one who received the call. He felt the air thicken. Memory arrived in a hot rush that had nothing to do with current danger and everything to do with a hollow place in his chest left by a loss years earlier. He imagined a boy huddled in the dark, hands small and surprised at the enormity of everything. He pictured the playground bench and the Polaroid and felt a collapsing, as though the ground had opened. He pushed that sensation aside and moved with the speed of someone who had learned to use panic as propulsion. The second moment arrived during the ingress, when a man recognized Elias from another life and pulled him aside with a question that was soft and dangerous. The man said, quietly, "Do you know what this boy looks like to me?" He said, "The eyes." Elias turned and felt the blood in his ears. The third moment was when the team found the place where the boy might be kept and discovered it was rigged with a trap they had not expected and had to improvise to avoid carnage. Each of these moments lasted exactly long enough to be survivable and exactly long enough to leave scars. Elias had a backstory he had told himself with the tenderness of a lonely man and the defensiveness of someone who had been forced to survive. He had grown up on the outskirts of a city that always felt like it was in someone else's hands. His mother was a seamstress, her fingers nimble and patient, who taught him the dignity of small work. He learned early what it meant to be careful with love. At 18, he met Marco in a room that smelled of smoke and perfume, a chance meeting that turned into a clandestine affair full of intensity and danger. Marco offered him safety and power and a peculiar tenderness that was as violent as it was kind. Elias left that life when he discovered he was to be a father and feared bringing a child into a world lined with knives. He took a silent suitcase and disappeared with a stolen name and a pocket of shame. The son he left behind was taken from the hospital in a night arranged by people who took children for reasons obscured by debt and greed. Elias spent years searching in small ways, leaving notes in orphanages, paying for whispers at some soup kitchens, hoping for a footprint of proof. Each false lead taught him to be quieter and more cunning. He taught himself to be the kind of man who could scrub a kitchen floor for 12 hours and come home to a bed that smelled like bleach and loneliness. The backstory came in 4 short passages, his inner narrator repeated like scripture. It explained why he had turned away from the power he had once known, and why going back now felt like the edge of a cliff and a rope ladder at once. He had sacrificed rising to a life of ordinariness so his son could have a chance at a name without shadow. He had given up the possibility of returning to the kind of intimacy that Marco offered, because he associated it with risk and with a brutality that had no moral center. He had hidden his son's face in his heart and allowed that hiding to become a form of prayer. That history was sharp enough to cut. As the team moved toward the warehouse, Marco's demeanor shifted from composed to incandescent. He paced with a kind of purposeful cruelty, issuing orders and carving spaces for men to move into. Marco consulted Lucia on documents that would buy them access, Rafi on the placement of men, and Gabriel on the van route. They ran a dry rehearsal in which Elias played the small parts and the others played him with tenderness that hurt. Elias had to keep telling himself that the boy whose image made his chest small was not yet his, that the photograph could be proof of lineage or could be the coincidence of similar eyes. The possibility that the boy might be his son was an eruption he smothered with duty. He rehearsed how he would hold the child, how he would move him without breaking the brittle world he wanted to rebuild. As they entered the compound at night, the city behind them hummed low and disinterested. The night air held the smell of diesel, damp concrete, and the acrid tang of something burned. The infiltration was a series of small beats, each one carefully executed. Rafi took the mechanical locks. Lucia handled the paper trail they used to misdirect a nearby patrol, and Gabriel maneuvered vehicles to block sightlines. Elias felt his palms sweat inside his pockets and tasted copper on his tongue. The team moved like an orchestra performing a piece where the audience could bring down the house. There was a brief scuffle in a hallway that left him with a bruise on his forearm and an odd sense of being both more and less alive than before. The confrontation in the holding room was the thing the rest of the night had been building toward, and it stretched time in the most intimate way possible. The room smelled of bleach and wet wool. Elias could hear the quick rhythms of men breathing and the buzzing of a single model. Fluorescent light that made the boy figure look smaller and more fragile. They found him curled in the corner on a blanket, looking like a discarded photograph that had somehow kept its clarity. When they pulled the blanket back, the boy blinked with that quick sharpness that children have and looked directly at Elias. For a moment, Elias had no name. He had no sense that this face could belong to him because kinship often arrives as a slow recognition rather than a thunderclap. But the boy reached for Elias without fear and touched his wrist the way a child does when the world is small enough to ask for comfort and the adult is the first source of shelter. Elias felt his lungs press inward and then open like something breaking open in a locked chest. There was a series of exchanges between them and the men watching, a mixture of commands and softening, of order and instinct. Marco was there, quiet at first, and then he approached with a measured calm that made the room colder. He crouched and looked the boy in the face, and something in his eyes moved that Elias had never allowed himself to describe. Marco said the boy had been moved after a debt had been called in, that the men who took him had thought to use him as leverage, and that they had hidden him where no one would look. He spoke with a competence that was dispassionate and disturbingly gentle. Then the boy spoke a name in a voice slotted to the hollow space of memory, a single syllable Elias had not admitted to missing all these years. The sound tore through the room like an unprotected wire. The world clicked into a new arrangement. Marco watched the exchange, and his face went oddly unreadable, the mask of power softening for the first time into something like recollection. There were more than 10 dialogues in that rescue scene, each line loaded with the freight of past connections and present consequences. People who had never said more than necessary said everything with their eyes. Rafi grunted a joke that landed like a bridge being crossed. Lucia barked instructions about extraction and medical care. Dr. Pierce checked the boy for injuries with a professional tenderness and then declared him physically intact.
Elias spoke to the boy in small sentences, the kind of language built for healing, asking about favorite foods, favorite games, whether he liked the sun or the noise of trains. The boy said he liked trains because they sounded like whales. Elias smiled, and the sound surprised him. The extraction was flawless and violent and finally tender. They moved the child out into the pale night where a van hummed and the city looked like a scattered constellation. Elias held the boy and felt the weight and the breath and the way the small chest rose in time with his own. He thought he would sob, and he did not.
But instead, he made a promise in his head that was sharp and clean. He would never allow the boy to be taken again. But the rescue was not the end of consequence. It was the beginning of a reckoning. Marco called in favors and placed threats like chess pieces on a board that had been playing without Elias' presence. There was retaliation from men who had been shortchanged in deals, and from those who lost money when their leverage dissolved. A small bomb went off in a warehouse owned by one of Marco's allies, and men were hurt. Elias felt the wind of retaliation move through him as if he had been part of something contagious. The city responded with rumor, and then with police interest that could no longer be ignored. Elias watched, satisfied and horrified, as his life folded into a world of power where even saving someone exacted a price. Marco sat with Elias later on the penthouse balcony, the city a smear of lights, and spoke in a voice that was softer for being honest. He said that he had felt something shift when he saw the Polaroid, something he had not allowed himself to feel for years. He said he did not know at first, not in the way a man who compartmentalizes can ever know anything soft. He confessed that an informant had told him a detail he could not shake, a trait about the boy that mirrored a picture Marco had kept hidden in a drawer, a photograph of a light-haired child he had once cradled before the world became too bloody for tenderness. Marco had never confessed this to anyone. He had a file with names and faces, and he had compared them in the lonely mathematics of men who lose and hoard. The truth was now a delicate coal between them. The revelation arrived in a voice like a scalar drop. Marco had found a birthmark on the boy's neck, a small crescent near the nape, described in an old letter from a nurse Marco had tracked down after a night of rumination and guilt. That crescent matched an image in Marco's drawer, and the drawers of memory flung open. Marco told Elias quietly that there was a possibility the boy was his. The words landed like something heavy and warm. Elias took them like a hand he had not expected. There was silence long enough for a building to be thought of as an organism. Elias felt the possibility in his bones like a tide rewriting the shore. He had wished for this and feared it, and now both states sat together in his chest like two animals in an uneasy barn. He thought of all the years he had kept a photograph and flung it away in temper, and then carefully folded it again. He thought of Marco and the way that man loved with the same skill he used to destroy. He thought of the boy, and the way his fingers fit around Elias' wrist. The line between salvation and surrender blurred. After the rescue, Marco had to decide what to do with the truth. He could keep it private and let Elias mend in the small, mundane world he had returned to, or he could claim a stake in a life he had once exchanged for power. Marco chose neither neatly. In the quiet of his office, he asked Elias to stay, to accept a role advising him quietly, a form of amparo that would shield Elias and the boy from men who might seek retribution. The request was practical and possessed of a tenderness that made Elias ache. It was also a challenge. Accepting meant a return to closeness with Marco and a rebirth of things Elias had once given up. Refusing meant stepping away with the boy and making a life built on constant flight. The choice was a bridle on his throat. There were several conversations that night, long and wandering and intimate, a series of exchanges where they argued and whispered and confessed. The dialogues were honest and charged with the old chemistry that had once made them reckless. Marco asked what he had done in the years away, and Elias admitted to nothing heroic, to nights at the diner, to small acts of kindness, and a poverty he had learned to weave into respectable shape. Marco confessed to regret and a kind of cultivated loneliness. They both claimed to want the same small thing.
safety for the child. The epilogue that closed this chapter came in 3 parts and detailed a slow rearrangement of lives. 1 month later, Elias had moved the boy into a small apartment 2 bus trips from the river. The place smelled of lemon and fresh paint, and the building hummed with the sound of a neighbor elderly woman who clapped at evening television shows. Elias had stopped flipping the Polaroid open like it was a key, and instead stuck it on a pinboard where the child could see it when he was older. He had taken the boy to a clinic where Dr. Pierce had checked for trauma and stitched a tiny scrape and recommended therapy. They ate noodles at midnight and watched a boat move across the water, and the child learned to call Elias by his chosen name. Marco sent food sometimes, and a guard who would sit in the van down the block and make sure no one followed them. The city calmed in small ways. 3 months later, the boy laughed without the split hesitance that fear builds. That laughter sounded to Elias like light striking a glass. He started working part-time at a community center that helped families with legal forms, and he met people who did not know him as Marco's partner or as a fault. He learned to cook a small set of dishes and discovered that the boy liked oranges because they smelled like the summer
of his brief memory. Marco had paid for an attorney to look into the original hospital record and, quietly, had his people close small loopholes that had enabled the child to be trafficked. The legal campaign caused a ripple among men who had benefited from the old silence, and there were threats that arrived like letters full of spelling mistakes and the smell of cheap cologne. The city watched, and it watched without the tenderness of its own. 6 months later, they hosted a small community event in a park where the boy ran with other children, and Elias watched from a bench and felt a clarity he had not expected. The man who had once been his lover and his danger had retreated into a more private life, but he remained a presence that moved through days like weather. Marco sat at the back of the park with a coffee and a distant smile, and sometimes joined them for dinners that remained awkward and tender in equal measure. They established a small foundation to help children at risk, a tangible consequence for the violence they had endured, with Marco funding and Elias running many of the support groups. The foundation was both a shield and a confession. People whispered and some applauded, and others hated the idea of forgiveness intertwined with power. Elias found that rebuilding trust was a craft, small and deliberate, and that his son could one day choose whether to name Marco as father or not. Elias had reclaimed a life and accepted that it would always carry the possible price of association. There were lingering moral tests. Elias was not naive. He had seen men in power behave like tidal forces, and he had felt what their love cost. There came moments when choices had to be made about compromising to get more children saved and about what lines would never be crossed. He chose to draw a clear border around the things he would not do, and to allow Marco to act in the gray areas where Elias would not stoop. The balance was fragile and required daily negotiation between desire and principle. Marco learned to soften in public and to be ruthless in private, and to apologize in ways that meant something to Elias. There was a night where Marco confessed to a private regret so deep he could barely make it a sentence. He told Elias that he had thought power would shield him from the pain of loss, but had found that power only made pain more precise. Elias forgave in small measures and demanded action in return. The small actions were scaffolding for a life that might, if they were lucky, become normal. At the core of this story was a dilemma that would not leave them. Could Elias remain near a man who had once been the access of his pain and now the access of his son's safety? He questioned whether choosing closeness meant they were rebuilding a life or rebuilding an empire. The boy grew and asked questions about absent fathers and about what people owed those who hurt them. Elias answered as best he could, with honesty and with the precaution that the truth can wound. He taught by small gestures and by allowing the boy to take small risks. Marco, for his part, dismantled a few of the darker operations and turned eyes to building legal pockets of power that could protect rather than extort. The combination was messy and miraculous, and hardly a redemption arc cleaned for public consumption. But in the quiet of evening, when the boy slept and the city hummed low, Elias allowed himself to believe that shelter could be constructed from other materials than silence. If you found yourself in Elias' shoes and had to choose between asking a man who once hurt you for help or trying to do everything alone, what would you do? Comment, "I am alone," or "ask help" in the comments, and add one word to explain why. Your answers will be read and highlighted, because different perspectives help others see more than they could alone. This community values honest reflections and brave confessions. While you decide, the story keeps unfolding, and the cost of choices will become clearer in the next scenes. In the end, the rescue did not erase all harm or absolve all accountability. It changed lives in small, measurable ways. A small network of names had formed into a collective that could no longer be ignored by men who trafficked children in the hidden corners. Miguel, a district attorney with a lean face, used evidence gathered by Dr. Pierce to reopen an old case and close a loop in chain of custody that had allowed children to be pre-selected for trafficking. Lucia found herself in a courtroom as a witness against a mid-level broker who had once been on Marco payroll. Enzo and Anton became allies in a community oversight board, using their street knowledge to prevent future abductions. Theo opened a shelter for kids found on the street and named it after a small star his grandson liked to point to. The city changed in ways that were not instantaneous, but were perceptible in the small gestures of merchants who hired formerly implicated men, and in the way mothers let their children play a little longer at dusk. The last scene left on the viewer is not tidy. Elias watches his son run in a park and thinks of the weight passed between men and of a life reconstructed from shards. Marco comes up behind them and wraps his hands around Elias' shoulders in a gesture he had once used for comfort and now used as restitution. They both watch the boy and do not speak. The ending line that lingers is a promise and a question. Safety is not the same as love, and power is not the same as redemption, but both can be used to save on. Life, and perhaps that is the work of living.